So we're really, again, excited to get started here. And now I'd love to introduce our panelists. Today we have Sujal Shah and Cayenne Demchak, who are very just gracious with their time. So I want to thank them and appreciative of their time. So Sujal, we'll get started with you. I would love to introduce yourself and tell the attendees today about yourself.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me here. So Sujal Shah, I am originally from Chicago, Illinois, born and raised, went to undergrad and grad school for my first rotation in grad school in Chicago. I'm a biomedical engineer by training. My first job after grad school was actually in the back of an informatics lab in Pittsburgh. That's what brought me to Pittsburgh back in 1999, actually. And so I worked at this company a few short years. At some point decided I didn't want to spend the rest of my career in a lab. And given I was working for a pretty obscure small startup company, I felt like the only way I could get noticed by big biotech or pharma was to actually get to business school. So I went to Tepper. I graduated in 2004. In fact, it was an interesting time because between 2002 when I started and 2004 when I graduated is actually when David Tepper made his initial investment, and the name of the school was actually changed. So it was a really unique time. I think I served on the first ever GBA that we started right around that time. I was a community outreach position in my second year there. Let's see, I concentrated mainly in finance and accounting and entrepreneurship. The clubs that I was involved with included BioTech, naturally, as a biomedical engineer by training. It was the industry that I've always had an interest in, but I also participated in the finance and the golf club. And so I'd say up until last year, given the trajectory of my career, business school was the last time I played a ton of golf. And I think I finally beat that last year because in COVID, there's not much else to do. I finally joined a club for the first time in my life. So I had really quickly just envisioned that I would go into biotech doing BD. My path took a little bit of a different turn while I was in business school. I learned more about investment banking. Eventually, I went to Wall Street and I worked as an investment banker covering the healthcare sector for about 8 years, half that time in New York, and then eventually the other half that time in the Bay Area for a couple of investment banks on the street. And then I left in 2012 to come back to industry. And I've been with a small development stage biotech company called CymaBay Therapeutics, took the company public, initially CFO of the company, and then have been the CEO for about 4 years now. And that's where I've been since that time.
Awesome. Well, really excited to chat with you today, Sujal. And now I'd love to introduce Cayenne. Go ahead, take it away and introduce yourself to the attendees today.
Thanks so much, Ben. Good afternoon or evening. It's definitely evening everywhere for most of you, at least. Cayenne Demchak. Let's see, where am I from? I grew up in New England, but had been in the DC area prior to Tepper. I actually was in the healthcare world in DC doing policy analysis. And in a weird twist of fate, I was planning to go to policy school, and a health economist at a conference that we were working with said, if you went to business school, you'd have a whole lot more luck getting a really good job. And so I decided to do a dual degree. So I was an MBA, MS HCPM, Masters of Healthcare Policy and Management at the Heinz School. I was also a strategy, I think marketing and OrgB concentrations at Tepper. OrgB is one of the most underrated concentrations at Tepper. That's one of my hidden pieces of information that I always give to students who are thinking about school. Let's see, clubs and leadership roles. I was also in GBA. I think we called it Chief Activities Officer. My year, I don't know if that's still what you call it, but think of me as the social person. I planned the parties and events. It was the absolute best. It was so much fun. And I was also a member of Tepper Women in Business. I was a member of Graduate Finance Association my first year because I really wanted to get into M&A, and at the time, corporate finance was the easiest way in. As it turns out, you can get there, at least inside a company, not going through a finance route. I interned and then came back and have been with Cigna Healthcare ever since graduation in 2009. I've been in a number of roles, but several of them involved business development and strategy. So I've gotten to be a part of several of our large acquisitions and numerous acquisitions that never happened. Which is probably the most common part of mergers and acquisitions inside of a firm. I'm currently Chief Innovation Officer for Cigna Medical Group, which is a wholly owned subsidiary based in Phoenix, Arizona. I am actually based in Nashville. I used to travel on an almost weekly basis. And for the last year, I've gotten to sleep in my own bed, which has been pretty spectacular. Let's see, favorite Tepper memory. I'm actually going to say it was my 10-year reunion. We had it just a couple of years ago, and it was spectacular. We said, gosh, being in business school is a whole lot more fun when you can actually afford to go out and do stuff. And so it was really nice to be with the same people that we used to see at beers and get to share memories of being in school, but also all of the amazing things that we've accomplished since leaving.
It's awesome. I'm looking forward to my 10-year reunion 2032. It seems like a long time away.
It'll go by so fast.
Right. Just a reminder to all our attendees, if you have any questions for Cayenne or Sujal, feel free to throw them in the Q&A. We'll get to them in 20, 25 minutes or so. So as they pop up, we will get to them. So I'll first start out with a question about the healthcare industry. Both of you briefly touched on it, but where did your interest first peak when it comes to healthcare? And I guess when you first got into your first role in the industry, what was that reason? And then what keeps you there today? Sujal, we'll start with you on that one.
So, I grew up not atypical of most, Asian American immigrant children, where I was given a choice of either becoming like a doctor or an engineer. And although it wasn't necessarily forced on me, that was really all my influence. So I gravitated to the sciences. When I decided I wanted to study biomedical engineering, I just loved the intersection of math, physics, and human biology. It was an incredibly interesting discipline. It was tough. It wasn't necessarily the easiest. I wish I picked a little bit easier major. I might have had a little more fun in undergrad. But it was really interesting to study the human body with actual electrical engineering, material science engineering, computer science engineering discipline applied to how we're effectively made and how we function. So that had been my earliest influence. I actually did research in grad school for a period of time using biodegradable polymers to regenerate cartilage and bones. So it's pretty interesting work. It's part of what actually brought me to Pittsburgh after grad school. Working in that same area. Pittsburgh's, for those of you that don't yet know it, is a big transplant center in the country, one of the top transplant centers in the world, actually. So that's the origins of my interest originally. And so even when I decided I wanted to leave the lab and do something more on the business side of our industry, in fact, I envisioned I would do BD, as I mentioned, in biotech or pharma. My internship was at Roche, doing business strategy and business development. And so even though I decided I wanted to get out of the lab and do something different, it was always still within our industry and within our sector. And having come back to the industry after 8 years in banking, I think it's probably sounds pretty trite, but it's true at the end of the day. You have an opportunity to work on something incredibly challenging and interesting from a science perspective, fulfilling from a career perspective. And at the end of the day, the end goal is to improve patient lives and improve people's lives. So we get to see it. I get to see it firsthand. We went through a pretty challenging last 18 months where there was a potential safety concern in one of our studies. We had no idea what it meant. It was really unusual. It wasn't typical. In the end, it turned out to be a false alarm. But when we put all of our clinical studies on hold, just to give you an example, we had patients reach out. I had patients reach out to me specifically, just devastated they had to come off of our treatment because it was the best they'd ever felt in many years. So when you get to see that end goal, we talk in our industries about customers and always understanding the customer, which is critically important. At least in our industry, some of those customers are people and patients and their families. And that's at the end of the day, for me, it's what's driven my interest. And the science has as well. We're in a really interesting time in our industry where the advances, as you're seeing with the vaccines, for example, mRNA technology and vaccines has actually existed since 1990, but it really didn't accelerate until we poured money into it, until we really, really needed it. And but the kinds of advances occurring in at least biotech and the life sciences world are quite extraordinary today. And to the degree that we think about these things as not as a straight line, but almost exponential growth in knowledge, that's basically what we're experiencing. So who knows what we're going to see in the next 10 to even 15 years in these industries.
That's really exciting stuff. Cayenne, go ahead. I know you had a comment.
Yeah, I feel like I can't live up to any of that amazing stuff, Sujal, but I kind of fell into healthcare. I come from a long line of educators. So most of my family are teachers, and I got a job. I really wanted to work in DC. I got a job in a nonprofit doing development, so asking people for money, and very quickly realized I was not cut out to do that. And somebody left the health policy section of our organization, and I said, "Can I have that job instead?" And they said yes, and that was the beginning of the rest of my career, really. I don't think I knew that just asking that simple question was going to set me off. But I knew coming to Tepper that I wanted to go back to healthcare. I knew very specifically I wanted to go to insurance. I was leaving DC at a time when most of the innovation in how healthcare was paid for and delivered was happening in the private sector as opposed to happening in Washington. I wanted to actually do all of the stuff that we were talking about and trying to get Congress to pay attention to. And so I sought out the handful of insurers who were recruiting at business schools at the time. And today I stayed with Cigna partially because it's a very mission-driven organization, and I believe in what we do each and every day. But to Sujal's point, the last year especially has been really impactful. I've had the opportunity to put into place programs that didn't exist the day before. So things like same-day drug delivery, so that patients didn't have to leave their homes to come to the pharmacy during the pandemic. We launched virtual care for our patients so that they could see their primary care physicians and their specialists during the pandemic without having to leave home. We did things like literal device delivery because a lot of patients didn't have smartphones or tablets to be able to connect to their physicians. And so we literally had somebody, we contracted with a local company that literally would drop off a laptop that was already open for a virtual visit. So all the patient had to do was pick it up off their front steps, complete the visit, and put it back out there. It was just immensely gratifying to know that we were helping to make sure that patients had access to the care that they needed, although it wasn't really safe for them to be coming into the clinics because we were doing COVID tests, we were doing the monoclonal antibody treatments as well. So we had COVID positive patients in our doors. We were trying to keep people out as much as possible. Now we're doing vaccinations as well. So it's really been an incredible year to be part of the healthcare arena. But I go back, it must have been maybe the first 18 months or so of the Trump administration. And I remember President Trump it was an actual interview, it was not a tweet, that he made a comment about who knew healthcare was really hard? I remember thinking, and the entire industry sort of chuckling and saying, yeah, we all knew that healthcare was really hard. And that's one of the things that I love about it. It's a constant challenge, and it really gives you something that you can be helping people at the end of every day, but also something that's really going to continue to challenge you because it's only going to get more and more complex.
I mean, you guys both described, just how challenging it can be, especially with COVID. And now it's almost as if the industry is completely changed, kind of where it was at COVID at the beginning and to where it is now. Now that most of the population is getting vaccinated, and you mentioned mRNA technology, it's kind of great to see how far it's come. So both of you talked about how much you've had to deal with changes along the way within the industry. So I'm just curious, as a Tepper alum, for both of you, kind of what resources have helped guide you along your career journey so far, not only as a student, but beyond in your career path so far? Maybe Cayenne, we can start with you and some of the resources you've used.
Yeah, so I would say number one has been my network. Reaching out to classmates or other alums, whether it's on specific topics. A lot of times I've had classmates come in to pitch as consultants on certain topics, and it's nice to be able to also give them some advice of how to position something, knowing who they're going to be chatting to or talking to. So network, definitely number one. Early on, I definitely pulled out notes and books back when we still had textbooks. I don't know if those are things that you guys actually even still use or if everything is online. But I'd pull out workbooks. I still have, actually, you can't see it behind me, but this bookshelf, there's a very large binder that was my one of my strategy classes that I've kept everything because I refer back to it pretty often when I'm thinking about different, whether it's product strategies or thinking about acquisitions and how to position it as we're having to bring stuff to the board. So I'd say actually keeping the stuff, because you will refer back to it, it will diminish over time because it starts to become slightly irrelevant. But the network of people that you have access to is by far your greatest opportunity.
Yeah, I think, I'll just add a couple of comments to it. Just when I think back to even just the 2 years actually at Tepper, by far, what I leveraged the most in finding opportunities that really painted the path to the rest of my career thus far are the individuals that I met. And, I vividly recall meeting people from the MSCF program, meeting part-time MBA students versus just the full-time, which is, I was there full-time. The importance of literally just sitting in the sofa. I guess you can't do that as much right now until everyone gets back to the building, and just introducing yourselves to the people around you, getting involved in clubs. I've got an anecdote. I'll try to make this really quick. My opportunity in banking, there were no investment banks that came to recruit at Tepper back in 2002, 2003, and 2004. And so in order to find that opportunity, I had to go find the connections myself and then just apply and just get in front of the right people. And it was actually this MSCF student that was doing some work for a banker at Credit Suisse. And I randomly just introduced myself to this guy. Never had any idea what he did or what he was involved with. I just befriended this individual, and eventually through him got a chance to meet a banker. And then it was through the BioTech club where, as a first-year student, most first years didn't help run this one-day BioTech event we used to put on. It was all the second years that did that. But because I worked in BioTech locally, I just raised my hand and said, okay, well, give me like a part of the day. I'll organize myself with just local BioTech people. And so they folks said, okay. And at the end of the night of this one-day BioTech event that the club put on, we had these 3 speakers, and one of them was an investment banking director at Credit Suisse, the same guy that this other MSCF student used to work with. And he's the one who actually convinced him to come and speak. And, like many events you all have been to, these folks had a horde of students surrounding them at the end of it. And so I never really got to ask him any question. That wasn't really my environment or my style. And all of a sudden, right at the end of the entire night, one of the second years who was running the event was about to call those guest speakers, the highlight speakers of the night, a cab back to their hotel. So this is pre-Uber. And I overheard him and I said, well, don't call them a cab. I'll drive them to their hotel. And that was my shot at having 5 minutes of this guy's ear. And had I not been involved in that BioTech club or not involved in putting on that one single day event, I like, and maybe some luck of actually hearing him, about to call a cab, I would have never had this guy's ear for 5 minutes. And luckily I jumped on it. I didn't even have a car, by the way. Then I had to call and get somebody to bring their car to campus so I could drive these guys to their hotel. And from there, the rest is history. I went and met him in New York eventually and hustled a bit more to get into interview rounds over there and then got my offer. But you can't predict these things, obviously. So, these are lessons that most of you all pretty much know, I'm sure. But the more people you meet in those four walls in the building and outside of them, there's no telling where those connections are going to lead. So, and even outside those four walls, we were chuckling a little bit before the call here as to whether or not Cayenne and I would be open to getting inbound emails or questions on LinkedIn. And I felt like saying, I did say it, I said, yeah, absolutely. If we can't teach people how to reach out, cold call or cold email people on LinkedIn, then we're missing something, And so, and I'll be frank, the number of people that actually follow through and connect with people on LinkedIn is not as much as you would imagine, And so I think these things are incredibly important. Just as Cayenne said, you've got to build your network because there's no telling where those opportunities are going to come from or what's interesting and what's not interesting to you unless you get a chance to expand that.
Yeah, just one add, Ben, I'm sorry, before we move on, Sujal, because your story about chatting with one of your classmates. The other thing is you have no idea where most of these people have been beforehand. And so a lot of them have worked for the exact same companies that you're interested in going to work for. And even if they're not going back there, they still have connections and can open doors that you wouldn't believe. And so making sure that you're making those connections and figuring out, not meeting people just for the sake of using them necessarily, but getting to know them so that you can figure out if there's somebody who might have one random connection that can get you in the door.
Yeah, and those 2 years fly by really fast. I'm sure both of you can attest to, and BioTech is almost done, and I'm in my first year, and I'm almost on my first year. So make as many connections as you can, and obviously the two panelists, both Sujal and Cayenne today, have definitely used that and leveraged that to their advantage. Now, thinking back to the start of your MBA journey, maybe before you came to Tepper, right when you were coming in, what advice would you give to maybe your younger self before you came to Tepper, or right when you're at the start of your journey? If there's anything you can look back on and say, I wish I would have done this or something. Sujal, why don't you go ahead and start?
So, I think probably the one thing I would tell myself is to have more patience. I always remember the first week of business school, you start working on your resume, which was really unusual to me, right? It's like literally in the midst of the math camp that we had. We're already drafting our resume in the first week of business school. I felt like, well, I haven't even learned anything. How am I supposed to be? Because of course you got to have an internship by the end of your first year. And even before Tepper, I'd probably tell myself in my early days as an undergrad and initially in grad school is just to have some patience. And I think this is just my personal sentiment. I think it's really important to create some depth somewhere. Today I describe myself as being mostly a generalist, to be frank. As a CEO of a development stage biotech company, I'm not a scientist, although I'm driven by the science. I'm not a PhD. I don't have an MD, so I'm not a clinician. And so I've largely been a generalist. I know a little bit I know enough about science to be dangerous. I know enough about medicine to be dangerous. I know enough about finance and banking now. I guess as I reflect, I eventually developed depth in 8 years of banking. The one thing I can do that most others, certainly in my company and in the industry, can't do is raise capital in development stage biotech. So that became my depth vertical, if you will. But I wish I created a depth vertical in the sciences more so than I even had. I wish I was a little more patient, and I wish I finished to get my a PhD. I left with my master's and a couple of years of research, and I wish I would have stayed and created depth in the early years, because I think there's a lot of opportunity to create breadth over time with experiences, especially now that you all are in business school. You either, most likely came from a different industry and are moving to a different discipline. Even those of you that are staying within a certain discipline are likely to do something somewhat different. So I think there's always a lot of opportunity to create breadth. And I just say, in those early years, even in business school, I wish I paid a little more attention to creating some greater depth that I can leverage more so, throughout the rest of your career.
I was hoping I would come up with a really brilliant answer as Sujal was talking through his. I think one was, I think of it somewhat in running terms, like run your own race. So there are going to be people who come in that were part of different programs, whether it's consortium or others, and they will have internships lined up before classes even start, because it's part of the way that those programs work. And that can be really intimidating when you are coming in, you are trying to figure out how to make your resume work, especially if you're coming from outside of the business world. It can be outrageously overwhelming. And reminding yourself that, although technically they are your competition, they're not. It's one of the things that I loved about Tepper was we were really a big family, because we were one of the smaller classes from a business school perspective. When you look at the top business schools, we were really small, and that had its benefits. While yes, you were absolutely interviewing against other people, I will never forget the story of one of the consulting firms had to change their interview questions because by the time they got to the third student, they knew the answer because the people who came out of the interview told them what the questions were. Like that doesn't happen at every school. And so instead of thinking about them as your competition, think of them as the people who are going to help you be a better version of yourself, and not be so caught up in the timelines that everybody else is working toward. Be aware of them so you don't miss the consulting timelines or the banking timelines if those are industries you're interested in, but run your own race.
That's really great advice. I know a lot of the attendees today are thinking about how they can make the best use of their time when they come to Tepper, so that's really great perspective. Now I'll just ask one more question before we get to some of the Q&A. So again, if you're in the audience, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A. We'll get to them right after this. One more question for Cayenne and Sujal that we have lined up. Some of these people are very interested in the healthcare industry, and obviously both of you didn't necessarily, you came to it along the way. So I'm curious, you come to your roles along the way. Now you're in innovation and now you're running your own company. What did you do at work, let's say today, kind of a typical day in your current role, and maybe it'll give some information, some of these students, some perspective. So what does a typical day look like? Cayenne, I guess we can start with you.
Oh, I feel like this is a terrible answer. It's really just a lot of meetings. I spend probably 90% of my day in meetings talking about everything from the different innovations that we're running, in some cases presenting to different groups around the country, trying to get them interested in how we would think about scaling the work that we're doing. Some days I'm talking to startups who we're looking to partner with. Some days I'm building slide decks from other slide decks that we've used before. PowerPoints, it's my best friend. I'm trying to think of other things that I did today. We did some brainstorming. I had 2 brainstorming meetings about some things that we're doing to reposition the strategy of my business unit and how we're going to go about that, who's going to be responsible for different pieces of it. I also had a team meeting. I have a brand new team member, so instead of a packed agenda, we talked through priorities and challenges, got updates on what everybody's watching on Netflix, and spent some good time just sort of team bonding. doing the human part, because as much as you can spend 8, 10, 12 hours a day in meetings or on Zooms, it helps to better have those connection points. Going back to the network, you have to really get to know and like the people that you work with as well.
So, if I were still in banking, this would be a really easy question for me to answer, because I just say 5 hours of Excel, 2 hours of PowerPoint, 5 hours of Excel, 2 hours of PowerPoint, until it all added up to about 18 hours, and then home. That was the day typically, at least the first few years of banking. Now I'm pretty fortunate. I got to be frank. I would never lie to anyone and tell you that I absolutely loved banking. I got a lot out of it. And there were parts of it that I enjoyed. The life sucked, but I knew it. I kind of knew what I was getting myself into anyways, so it was okay with me. Today I love my job. My days are never exactly the same. I feel incredibly fortunate. So, back to the depth versus breadth question, given my role is more broad and about breadth, there's, like I said, no 2 days that are ever the same. I started the day talking to a first-time CEO that one of our researchers asked me to speak to, because it was an ex-friend and colleague of his, and we chatted for about an hour about just getting companies started and the challenges that we face. So it was a networking, I just did it because it's fun to do. And then I spent another half an hour talking to bankers and capital markets people from one of the banks that covers us in research, just about financing strategy. Then I talked to one of our shareholders for an hour, another banker. I try to limit those these days, but there were 2 bankers in the day today. And then Mondays, we have our senior management team meeting. So I run a meeting with all of our executive team every Monday. And then I thought I'd get on to the Peloton and get my workout in. And unfortunately, I had to spend an hour talking to a board member. So I have to save that for after this call.
There's always time for a workout. I mean,
I was
now
gonna
that
say,
you're not a banker.
if it helps, Sujal, I did my ride and then Peloton strength this morning. So
there you go.
There's a common element there. I was super focused on today, but I wanted to mention one of the things that I love about working for a large company, not that startups and smaller companies don't have this opportunity. Tomorrow morning, the first 4 hours of my day are leading a strategy session with the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for my business unit. I'm the executive sponsor, and it's been about a year since we did our last strategy session, and a lot has happened in the world. And so we're spending 4 hours of a group of 10 of us from across our business unit talking through what our strategy is to help create a more inclusive and equitable culture, and things like that, that I think are one of the perks of my job, and getting the opportunity to continue to do the things that I'm passionate about outside of work as well.
That's fantastic. Fantastic. Just the breadth, right, of things you can do as a manager. So I believe we have some questions from the audience. Dedika, if you want to bring up some of those.
Yeah, speaking of, I guess the segue, Ben says breadth. I have a question here about depth. There's a question from a student or a prospective student about depth at Tepper. So his question is, do you see an opportunity to develop and this, I think it's based on what Sujal was talking about, where you knew enough to be dangerous, right? Do you feel like there's an opportunity to develop knowledge through classes outside of Tepper and within the greater Carnegie Mellon University community in the sciences and probably in the other subjects while you're here?
Yeah, look, I think the resources in and around Tepper and even University of Pittsburgh, if you're starting to just think about any connections in the sciences, is quite rich. I mean, I think UPMC is still the #1 employer in all of Pittsburgh, I believe. So I won't pretend that it's easy. I know I didn't do a great job of extending outside of Tepper per se. Those connections I made, whether it was MSCF or part-timers or full-timers, were still largely within the walls of the business program. I think there are opportunities, and Cayenne can speak to it because she was a dual major. One of the things that I'm doing on the alumni board is trying to figure out how we on the alumni board at Tepper can work with the Heinz School alumni board on things like diversity and inclusion. It's like, why not put our minds together? You guys are experts in policy, and we're coming at it from the private sector. These things need to connect in order to make some real change. So I wish I did a better job of it. I would say this: it's all possible. I don't believe it's not possible. They're all there. There are likely, scientists and engineers that would love to have someone with a business mind help them with a business plan. And, I think if you do some digging and reach out to a few of the folks within the school, there's no question you will find it. Like I said, I'm not going to pretend like I found it necessarily because I didn't spend the time on it. But I think those are the things to do. I mean, my undergrad school was Northwestern. I'm involved in this program at Kellogg, where we're sponsoring a project for a bunch of business school students to actually do a real world assignment for a company in various healthcare industries. It's a healthcare consulting lab. And so there's got to be folks, in and around tech transfer offices, for example. That might be a place to start. Go to a tech transfer office, find some folks that have. And so I think from there, you can start to spend the time creating some of that depth. I mean, I don't know that you're going to get a dual degree in biology or something like that, right? But that depth can come from the interaction with those individuals and finding something that you think is really exciting to work on. So I think it exists. It likely may take some time, and it'll definitely take some effort.
Yeah, doing the dual degree, I was forced to or chose to. Whichever way you look at it, to mix between the two schools. And I would say even that was really hard. My second year was basically all at Heinz, except for a handful of classes that I needed to take at Tepper. And so I didn't get to choose a lot of additional electives. So there were some classes that everybody took that I didn't get to take because I had classes I had to take at the same time at the Heinz School. But it definitely taught me to think differently. The people that were in my classes at Heinz were really different. I was surrounded by a handful of people who were doctors from other countries and had come to the States, and their licenses aren't recognized, and they were choosing to go down a different path. And so it was really interesting to hear and experience some of those stories and what they went on to do. A lot of them ended up in consulting or working for startups. And just a really different set of people with different backgrounds than what you would have experienced at Tepper. I think there's a much larger group of people interested in healthcare at Tepper today than there were even when I was there, and probably even there were probably even less so when you were there, Sujal. But it's a hot area for business schools now. And so as you think about the opportunity to take electives, once you move into electives, those electives do not have to be at Tepper. And if you have a strong background, either because of the work you've done or classes you took in undergrad, you can test out of a lot of the entry-level classes. There's one of my classmates that I can think of. I think he only had to take one required course in the entire first year because he tested out of all of the rest of them. So he took a ton of classes outside of Tepper because he had all these electives that he got the opportunity to take. And so if you want to, you can, but it's also okay not to, and to just use your network and connect with people that way.
Awesome. I actually have a follow-up question to you, Cayenne, from a student here. How did graduating, it's about recruiting, how did graduating at a different time due to your 2.5 year program affect your recruiting experience?
Yeah,
sorry. No, and I don't know if when you were here, was there a healthcare analytics concentration?
There was not.
Okay, so that might not be relevant to you, but
yeah.
Since so if you could answer the first question.
I can speak to the healthcare analytics piece as well. Not from experience with it, but my perspective as a hiring manager now. So I recruited on the Tepper timeline. So I got my internship and then accepted my full-time offer, and just they knew that I wasn't able to start until August instead of starting in June or July. And that was not an issue at all. I think if you're upfront with, what your timeline is, not every business school in the country is even on the same timeline. So there's a pretty good chance there's people starting at off times as it is. I think if you were trying to go into investment banking and you were doing a dual degree, that would probably be a problem. But outside of that, I think most employers are willing to work with that timeline. As far as the dual degree versus the healthcare analytics piece, I think it depends on what you want to do. If you want to go into healthcare analytics, you should absolutely go with that concentration as opposed to the dual degree, because you won't get a ton. You'll get some additional healthcare focused analytics in the dual degree program, but you'll get far more by staying and doing the concentration at Tepper, just knowing the rigor of the programs. But if you're interested more broadly in healthcare and you want to get exposure to the provider side, you want to get exposure to the policy side, I think the dual degree is really helpful in giving you a bit more breadth of, if you aren't familiar, especially if you aren't familiar with the healthcare industry, than what you would get doing the healthcare analytics concentration.
Awesome, thank you. We have another question. So I'm someone whose depth is in science via a PhD, and I'm curious how often you see executives who have made this type of transition from academia to biotech and pharma, and what you see as the benefits and pitfalls of such a transition from science to business. We could do Sujal first.
Yeah, so, I think at least within the world of biotech, we see it all the time. And in fact, generally speaking, I think it's the norm at the end of the day. So, and I think it's quite critical to at least have some of that depth, not just in a specific topic or a vertical, but just the discipline of going and answering a question, gathering data. I think it just demonstrates a training, if you will, that investors and others will rely upon, at least in our industry, in development stage biotech, life sciences. So I think it is actually the norm, and we do see it all the time. I think it does take people to break out of their comfort zone and have opportunities to interact with either venture capital firms or even within academia, tech transfer offices, and really start to break out and develop a lot of that experience. But I think it's common, and I think if you especially having now the opportunity to have gone through the business program, even though 2 years is hard to create a tremendous amount of depth in business, it gives you that exposure across all these different functions. And I think that can serve you well, having already established the depth as a PhD scientist. I think it's very common.
Awesome. Cayenne, did you have anything to add to that?
I'd say think about where you may have gaps that you would want to fill. So if you're used to being behind, a lab table or, working with the numbers, there are opportunities to take classes that will help you with presentation style, or one of the classes I did not get to take that I to this day wish that I had was business acting. And there's lots of really interesting opportunities to get some of the soft skills that you may not be lacking. But if you realize that you do have a gap in that space, you have the opportunity to get experience and exposure to fill some of those gaps. You're going to come to the table with a heck of a lot more rigor around the data and some of the harder skills that can be difficult for those of us who did not come with that background to get. And so you just have a different set of skills that you're bringing to the table, and different set of skills that you may need to work on.
Awesome, thank you. It's funny that you mentioned the different set of skills. We actually have a question here about transitioning from a non-science background altogether. So if you don't come from science, what is it like, and is it possible to make the transition into healthcare and biotech? Maybe we'll start with Cayenne on this one and then go to Sujal.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think, business school in general is the best time to reinvent yourself. You know, it's rare that you find somebody who was doing something, comes to business school and goes back to doing the exact same thing. So you're really expected to come in as a novice. But I would say, especially if you want to get into, you know, the startup space or a really technical space within healthcare, you've got to do your homework. And a lot of that is not taught in the classes that you're going to have the opportunity to take at Tepper. And so joining the BioTech and healthcare club and getting to know, you know, what are the things that people, you know, need to be reading up on, who are the companies that you need to be following, what are the different, you know, programs that you could take, or connections that you can make with other parts of the broader CMU community to get as much learning as you can, so that you're not starting off from nothing when you walk into your internship, if you get an internship in one of those spaces. But you are not alone, not just, you know, healthcare and biotech, but you know, almost everybody around you is completely changing what they're doing with their professional career. And so everybody's there to help each other learn.
Yeah, the only other thing I'd add is, you know, I think it's important to be practical and be somewhat targeted. You know, I would never want to create a false impression that, sure, you can go get any job you want and everything is available to you. I think you really have to be smart about how you convince people what your, you know, what your talent is or what your knowledge base is that you can bring to the table. Even when I wanted to get a job in banking, you know, I wasn't going to convince anybody that I knew how to do the job. I'd never been in the role before. I had to convince them that I had enough knowledge of the science to understand the people we were serving, the companies we were serving. And that was my leverage. I just had to leverage that specific element. So if you're coming into healthcare and maybe biotech or something technical heavy specifically, just having, you know, a knowledge of what you bring to the table. Maybe it's valuing assets, and you don't really need to understand the mechanism of action of a drug as long as you understand the patient population, understand prevalence, understand penetration rates, understand how you price a drug in that environment, the competition, you know, to create a model of how to value an asset. So you can do business development inside of J&J, Merck, Pfizer, smaller biotech companies, because you understand the skill set of how to value something specific, even if you don't understand the science. So if you're smart about what your experience is and your skill set is, then I think there's always an opportunity to get into the industry overall. Certainly outside of biotech or life sciences, I think it's even easier if you're talking about healthcare services or healthcare delivery or insurance. You know, I think it's very common not necessarily to have a life sciences background necessarily, and you know, of course, the problems that Cayenne and companies like hers are facing are giant, you know, challenges that need a lot of insight from people with a lot of different backgrounds.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, we're gonna add something.
I would say some of the favorite people that we've hired into the leadership program that I came to Cigna through were former military, because they knew leadership and how to lead people and be able to set a vision better than literally anybody else we'd ever met. They knew nothing about healthcare. They, you know, had been to business school, but didn't have any business background outside of that. And they've been some of the best, most valuable leaders that we've hired into the organization.
That's awesome. Yeah, I know. I have a lot of friends who are vets in the program too, and they're just awesome to work with on projects, and their project management skills are incredible. So I have a question just about your network. So in terms of the Tepper Healthcare Network, maybe you don't, I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but do you have an estimate of the breakdown of your healthcare network here in terms of individuals in big pharma versus biotech versus provider versus payer? It's hard because this is a smaller program, so like it's difficult to say.
No, I think that's right. Given it's relatively small, I'd probably say it's 50-50, but you know, for me, more so folks in both biotech and pharma. I don't think it's overly weighted. I'd say probably more folks from Tepper in larger companies Roche and Merck and, the like, than smaller companies. But I think it's a mix now. Many years down the road, I've met quite a few people from smaller biotech companies now as well. Those that I know that come from the healthcare services side, like Cayenne, I've met through these kinds of experiences, not necessarily through my own work. It's just been mostly through involvement on the alumni board and these types of opportunities.
Yeah, I'd say of the four, provider is probably the lowest. For a whole host of reasons. They tend to recruit from a really different group of people. They don't tend to hire at business schools. A lot of them tend to hire from public health or healthcare administration type of master's degrees. But ton of people in the payer space, ton in biotech and pharma, and an outrageous number of people who went into consulting who ended up specializing in healthcare that didn't necessarily intend to. I can't throw a rock at a consulting firm and not hit a Tepper alum who's in the business now.
For sure. All right. Well, I know there's a couple of questions that haven't been answered, but we only have about 3 minutes left. So I wanted to give our panelists maybe a minute, 30 seconds to say anything if they wanted to kind of close up with their experience at Tepper and in healthcare. And then Ben and I will both put our emails in the text in the chat box. And so if there's anybody you'd like us to connect you with or any questions you might have about the program, feel free to reach out to both of us. We are students who work with the admissions office, and so we can answer those. But with that, maybe I'll leave it to Sujal to start if you have anything to say, just to wrap things up. Putting you on the spot a little bit here.
Yeah,
so.
no, it's it's fine. I just think back to some of the things that I wish I took stock of when I was there. I had obviously a great experience and have found opportunities that I love today. And just picking up on a point I mentioned before, to the degree that life will afford you the opportunity to have some patience, maybe even take another semester if you can afford to do so, and take more classes. People asking about dual degrees. This is the time to do it. After this, it gets a lot harder. Those would be things I'd think about. I recognize not everyone's situation allows for that. And so if you can't, then absolutely clubs, the networks inside the school itself are just absolutely critical. If you're not on at least several clubs and involved in some way, then you're just going to miss a big portion of that experience. So, I think there are a variety of different ways to branch out, and you have to do it now. This is the time. Like I said, I think, as a school and as a program, we talk about this on the alumni board. We're better than the rest of the world thinks we are at marketing ourselves. We're just typecast into this quote unquote technical MBA program, if you will. And I think we all can voice what we all think we bring to our industries more and more, if we just take the initiative to do so. So as a school, I think we need to do that. As an alumni group, we need to do more and more of that. And people should feel the confidence that they have the skill set coming out of Tepper, and then expand from that without question. And like I said, reach out to people. I didn't do more of it than I could have, even in the 2 years that I was there. There's so much happening and everything is moving so fast. And like I said, I think people would be surprised. In my 8 years in banking, maybe there weren't that many people that want to do banking anymore for some. I doubt that's the case, but I could probably count on two hands how many Tepper students reached out or found somehow myself. And maybe there were others. I hope, but to just connect. I eventually was able to get 4 people from Tepper at Credit Suisse First Boston after I joined. And so, you've got to do the things that sometimes are uncomfortable, or you think you're going to bother somebody. Just do it. They'll tell you if you're bothering them. I think the risk of not being aggressive and hustling is worse than being overly conservative.
Awesome. I'll just add really quickly on top of that. my assumption is most of you are going to business school because you want a different job than the job that you have. Remember that. While classes are absolutely important and you need to learn really important things in some of those classes, if you make grades your priority, you will not likely get the job that you want. There's a delicate balance between those two things, and spending the time to network and go to conferences or go to events. I don't know how you're doing corporate presentations these days, but those are really important, and making sure that you're spending the time to do that is incredibly invaluable. And then if you come to Tepper, you will be given a number of options for capstones. You should absolutely take management game. It is by far the single best class that I took at Tepper. I learned more in management game than I did in anything else that I did at Tepper, and everybody is afraid of it because it's really hard. And it's awesome.
Well, thank you all so much for the time today. I hope this was helpful for everybody